They've done it! They've done it! They've actually let me make a video about Kzinti. I'm really happy. I'm really happy. Make sure you check out the original article by our wonderful writer Frank Chavez, and thank you so much to our wonderful editor Tom, who's had to put up with me just dancing on the balls of my feet for this whole thing. I don't want to waste any time. I want to get straight into it. I'm Sean Ferrick for Trek Culture, and here are 11 things you didn't know about the Kzinti. Number 11. Star Trek Universe. The Kzinti appeared as a faction in games using the Star Trek setting published by Task Force Games and Amarillo Design Bureau. The setting was also used in computer games published by Taldron and Interplay. The setting was partially based on the Starfleet Technical Manual released by Franz Joseph in 1975. Now, this setting was officially licensed, but it also sort of wasn't. So the setting itself could only incorporate some elements of things like Star Trek the Animated Series, but it wouldn't be able to incorporate anything from the Star Trek movies or Star Trek The Next Generation TV series. This version of Star Trek's Kzinti walked with a hunched over gait and bat-like ears. They had no tails and looked kind of like upright tigers in that way. The name of their territory was never actually stated in the game, but later on we would learn that it was the Kzinti hegemony ruled by the Patriarch. In Starfleet universe, the Kzinti have waged war against the Federation, the Klingons, and their main enemies, the Lyran Empire. They've also been depicted as allies of the Hydran Kingdoms. Number 10. They have appeared in Star Trek novels. When a character or alien turns up on Star Trek, they're pretty much guaranteed to turn up in a Star Trek novel. The Kzinti have so far appeared in 2 Alan Dean Foster novels, one being Star Trek Log 5 and the other being the novelization of the episode, The Time Trap. They've also appeared in the pocketbook novel Ishmael by Barbara Hambly. All of these novels, rather than, say, forwarding the plot more so, they kind of revisit and add texture and depth to stories that have gone before. So Log 5, for example, is an anthology of 3 various Star Trek animated episodes. It opens with a flashback when Enterprise's Caitian officer Emrys recounts an attack on her previous vessel, the USS Hood, by the Kzinti. The novelization of The Time Trap mentions the Kzinti alongside the Klingons and Federation, while Kirk is pondering the Adosians' neutrality. In Ishmael, a starbase commander recounts her time serving on the USS Republic when she worked alongside Orions and Kzinti. She actually then goes on to greet Kzinti in their own language. Number 9. There is at least one Kzinti in Starfleet. You all know how happy I was when the Kzinti appeared on screen in Star Trek Lower Decks. Ensign Taylor is a member of the Redshirts group on the Cerritos. He's a little different from the way Kzinti have been depicted before, in that he makes sure that he's walking upright the whole time, doesn't have the hunched back, and, is fairly peaceable to his co-officers. As we know at the time of recording, the second season of Star Trek Strange New Worlds is going to see a live-action crossover between Pike's Enterprise and Mariner and Boimler. Don't you think that this might open the door for some live-action Kzinti to finally arrive in Star Trek? Oh yes, it will happen. It will. Number 8. They were related to Caitians. According to the biography of Caitian Communications Officer Emrys, provided by Lincoln Enterprises, Caitians and Kzinti were related in much the same way that Vulcans and Romulans had also been related earlier on. The main differences here was that Caitians were a bit smaller, a bit more sinewy, whereas Kzinti were huge hulking creatures that were often over 2 meters tall. In Kzinti, the females of the species were often seen as something only worth breeding with, barely above animals, whereas with Caitians, the two sexes were treated quite equally. In Caitian society, it was more important to advance science and art, whereas Kzinti society was much more concerned with acts of valor and bravery. We have actually seen Caitians in live action as well. Well, we have seen Kzinti, but I'll come to that. In Star Trek Into Darkness, co-writer Damon Lindelof confirmed that Kirk's bedmates were in fact Caitians. Number 7. Kzinti earned their names. Now, unlike you or I, who were probably given our name at birth, Kzinti would have no names until they were earned by acts of valor. Although the Kzinti naming convention, created by Larry Niven when he wrote them into being, wasn't specifically named in the episode The Slaver Weapon of the animated series where they appeared, you can see this by lower tier Kzinti being referred to by job posting as opposed to name. You would have these Kzinti of low status, if you will, called things like technician or pilot. There was even a captain who had a sort of a half name, Chuffed Captain, which showed that they'd won some distinction, but they hadn't actually gone far enough to earn a name. Kzinti, who particularly impressed for the patriarchy, their empire, could actually go so far that it goes beyond getting a name like Sean and getting many names, as a name was almost like a badge of honor for all of their deeds and accomplishments. Number 6, some of them were telepathic. There have been many telepathic species in Star Trek. Think, for example, the Betazoids, the Vulcans. Now, unlike those two species, it was only the Kzinti males that had the ability to use telepathy. Now, what's more is that the effort involved would leave the Kzinti exhausted, depressed, and often quite neurotic. The telepath that we saw in the episode The Slaver Weapon was so dejected, in fact, that he looks like he just had 7 shades of kicked out of him. His fur was matted and he looked like he was about to drop into a coma at any moment. Another thing about this is that Kzinti telepaths just flat out refused to read the minds of herbivores or females because they felt that there just wasn't enough going on in the brains of either of those. There was a very good way of turning it back on the Kzinti as well by simply thinking of things that they didn't want to think about, like eating raw vegetables. Number 5, and you thought Ferengi were misogynistic? And other prejudices. The Ferengi were well known as one of the most misogynistic races in the galaxy, forcing their women to stay home, not earn profit, and stay naked. That is, of course, until Ishka got the lobe of Grand Nagus Zek. However, the Kzinti make the Ferengi look like feminists. They considered the female to be barely above the upright animal. Basically, they thought nothing's happening in the brain, and they just didn't even consider them as people in their understanding of it. In The Slaver Weapon, although the name of their empire, the Patriarchy, isn't said on screen, you can see the effect of that everywhere, to the point where Spock actually says they can use this as a tactical advantage. He says to Uhura that if they can pretend Uhura conforms to the Kzinti idea of what a woman is, they might be able to get around their security protocols by using her, who they won't be looking at. Now, of course, Uhura is not particularly thrilled to hear this, but it does work toward the advantage of the ship. Another way, of course, to mess with the Kzinti is, as we mentioned, think of something like eating raw vegetables. It'll make them ill. They had no respect whatsoever for herbivores, so they really weren't interested in what the Vulcans had to say, and they only had marginally more respect for a herbivore. Didn't really mean a human was in much better position. Number 4, they weren't allowed to have a military. According to the Slaver Weapon, after losing a series of wars to the Federation, they were forbidden from having or operating a military of their own. They were, however, allowed a police force and other law enforcement agencies, such as the Traitor's Claw, which was depicted in the episode. Another piece of equipment depicted in the episode was a sort of a club called a police web. Chuffed Captain used this police web to kidnap Spock and several other Enterprise officers and detain them in the Slaver Weapon. They did this while they went searching through an ancient stasis box that the Enterprise had picked up. Once the Kzinti had discovered the eponymous weapon, they planned on stealing it and bringing it back to Kzinti territory to then adapt and use to build up their own force again. However, possibly good for the rest of the quadrant, they blew themselves up while testing it. Number 3, they fought several wars with Earth. As established by Sulu in The Slaver Weapon, the Kzinti fought 4 separate wars with Earth in the latter half of the 21st century, losing every one of them due to the humans having superior technology. In Larry Niven's original story, The Soft Weapon, the war was fought using sublight ships, and the humans only prevailed because they acquired technology with faster than light capability. That presents a problem for Star Trek historians. We know that in 2063, Zefram Cochrane engaged in his warp flight, which drew the attention of the Vulcans. Now you could say, great, that's how they won the technology. But if the timelines are put side by side, that would mean the Kzinti were at that time engaging in a war with Earth. In 2067, as we know from the Voyager episode Friendship 1, Earth was only just sending out faster-than-light probes. It's unlikely in this version of history that the Kzinti and the humans were aware of each other. One fun little fact though, if we do believe that that happened, is that during these wars, the Kzinti would eat the flesh of whatever human they managed to capture. Chuffed Captain threatens the crew of the Enterprise with this in the slaver weapon. Number 2. A single writer made several pitches to bring them back to Star Trek. You've got a feel for writer Jimmy Diggs, who contributed to both Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Voyager. While he was interning on Star Trek The Next Generation, between those shows, he made so many pitches that basically Rick Berman started referring to them as Jimmy Diggs' Crazy Cats. He would go on to write a screenplay for an animated feature called Star Trek Lions of the Night that would feature Sulu, Chekhov and Uhura and the crew of the Enterprise B facing off against a Kzinti invasion. This idea actually got the support of Nichelle Nichols, George Takei, Majel Barrett Roddenberry and DC Fontana, but unfortunately it failed to impress the bigger ups at Paramount. He would later adapt an idea by Neil and Jenna Halford for Star Trek Enterprise that would become the script for Kilkenny Cats. Andrei Bormanis liked it so much that he arranged for him to pitch it to showrunner Manny Coto for the hopeful 5th season. Of course, as we know, Star Trek Enterprise came to an end at the end of the 4th season, so Kilkenny Cats was never produced. Diggs would go on to pitch another idea for the Star Trek Phase 2 fan series. Alas, that too came to nothing. Number 1. They weren't created for the show. Unlike pretty much every other alien race in Star Trek, the Kzinti were not specifically created as a Star Trek race. They had been invented by writer Larry Niven and first appeared in his short story The Warriors in 1966. The reason they appeared in Star Trek at all was because of DC Fontana. DC Fontana was effectively the showrunner on Star Trek the Animated Series. She was a friend of Larry Niven and asked, and received permission, to include them in the animated series. She also asked Niven to pitch a story idea, which he did. He pitched 2 scripts, but they were deemed too problematic for the animated series at the time. So instead, what they did is they worked on adapting his short story The Soft Weapon into what would become the Slaver Weapon that premiered on television on the 8th of December 1973. That is everything for our list for the moment. We know there's Kzinti in Lower Decks. They got a name drop in Picard. Will we see live action Kzinti in the future? We damn well better. In the meantime, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Thank you so much again to Frank Chavez for putting together this list for us. Bloody legend. And Tom, I had no idea where you found that footage, so fair play to you. Fair play. You can catch us over on Twitter at Trek Culture. You can catch us on Instagram at Trek Culture YT. Catch myself at Sean Ferrick on Twitter. And you can, of course, follow Tom at Tom C. Finn on Twitter as well. Yous are all awesome, lovely, and wonderful. Make sure that you live long and prosper. Look after yourselves. Look after your friends and family. Be kind to each other. Our friends in Ukraine, you are incredible and you are symbols of bravery, as are all of our trans family around the world. Everyone, make sure you have a lovely time until I see you again. Make it so.